All right, it's May 8th, and because of the fact that we went a little long on our morning session, we agreed that I would do a recorded version of the case discussion. So here's the approach we're going to take. I'm going to read out the case. I've already emailed this out to you as a handout if you'd prefer to have it that way. It was sent out last night. And then we'll get you to pause the video, answer the questions, and come back and see how you did. So this is based on a real case. Mr. Pantages is a respected drama teacher at Caldorpa Middle School. He has been teaching for 18 years. Mr. Pantages has a small dog named Cupcake. She's a gentle dog and she doesn't shed. She's a poodle. She is not a registered service animal. When he first got her about 5 years ago, he realized that she was not able to be left at home alone. So at first, he paid for the dog to attend a kennel every day, but that was costing about $125 a week. So about 4.5 years ago, Mr. Pantages approached the principal at that time, Mrs. Santucci, and asked if it would be okay with him bringing the dog to school on a trial basis. He stated that he believed the dog would be a positive influence in his drama classroom. Mrs. Santucci, the principal, was aware that the school district had a policy prohibiting dogs from being on school property except with special permission from an administrator. And she was an administrator, so she had the authority to make the exception. Mrs. Santucci made a decision to allow the dog on 2 conditions. First, Mr. Pantages would have to clean up after the dog while at school. And second, they agreed to a trial period of 2 weeks. If things did not work out after the 2 weeks, Mr. Pantages agreed that he would not be able to bring the dog to school. Mr. Pantages' prediction about the dog being positive in the classroom turned out to be very correct. Not only did the dogs really like the student, not only was the students really welcoming to the dog, but the feedback he got from them and the evidence he got suggested that students were actually much more likely to participate in drama when the dog was present. In fact, the dog even sometimes started to make it into their productions. Things continued to go smoothly over the last 4.5 years until last month. 2 new things have happened since then. First, a new principal named Mrs. Ewan is now at the school. The old principal has left. Mrs. Ewan is aware that Cupcake is coming to school and she knows about the prior arrangement, but she has not explicitly given her consent. She hasn't said it isn't okay and she hasn't said it is okay. She simply has left things alone. A new student named Carmen has enrolled in the school, and according to Carmen's mother, the student has both an allergy to dogs and a strong fear of them. She has asked the school to ensure that no dogs will be on the premises for her when her daughter attends. So Mr. Pantages doesn't know what to do at this point. So that's just like the cases that we have presented to you for submission. They are partly complete. Here are the 3 questions that I've asked you to answer. Again, exactly the same as in the assignment. The first question is, has anybody violated any principles in your case? If so, name the principles and explain how they have been violated. Number 2, what is the best way to proceed? Explain fully, showing how your responses satisfy the acid test. Be comprehensive and detailed. And 3, can you think of any other or alternative practices that could be used that would also be ethical? So you should describe some of them and explain why they didn't make your number 2 set of solutions, even though they are still ethical. All right, at this point, I'd like you to pause and do your best to answer the questions. And then once you've got it, restart the video and see how you did. All right, let's see how you did. Now, the first thing we need to acknowledge is what are the ethics that apply here. First of all, we should probably state that Carmen and her mother don't have to worry about ethics because their role in this is as receivers of service. They're stakeholders, but they're not professionals. So they're bound only by the law and by their own personal morality. But the teacher and the 2 principals all are from the family called educators, or the profession of educators. And even though the principles are very, very similar to the ones that you've learned about CSWs and EAs, they aren't identical. And so I needed to go and do a little bit of digging and make sure I had the right source. So we're going to assume that Caldorpa Middle School is in BC, and we're going to go look up the Teachers Regulation Branch standards for BC educators. Getting familiar with these is going to help us to first determine if anybody's done anything up until this point that was unethical. And we're going to then use the exact same principles to determine what's ethical now, or what to do from here that will be ethical. Now, I haven't gone through the steps of identifying what we know and don't know in the case because I simply haven't asked you to report on that. However, you definitely need to do that. You need to make sure that you start by being crystal clear about what's actually happened here and making sure that you haven't made assumptions or leaps by going with things that are based on your feelings or instincts. So now I'm going and looking at these educator status, and I'm going to go through kind of the short form of them, which in the case of educators isn't 1 or 2 words. It's a little bit longer. And then each of these statements has a longer paragraph. So I'm going to go through and look at them first in terms of the short form, and then I'm going to dig into the ones that I think might need a little closer examination. Educators value the success of all students, and educators care for students and act in their best interest. Well, when we look at this case, it looks like Mr. Pantages, Ms. Santucci, and Ms. Ewan have done, up until this point, things that were in the interest of the students. And Ms. Santucci in particular said that she was going to see if it worked for the students, and Mr. Pantages said that he thought it would work and has continued it because it has worked. So at this point, they have done things that were in the best interest of the students, and it's left to be determined what they're going to do with respect to Carmen's choice. So we cannot say we have any evidence that they have inappropriately responded to that yet. We haven't got a response yet. Number 2, educators act ethically and maintain the integrity, credibility, and reputation of the profession. Well, I'm going to use the sniff test at first, and I don't know that anything's been violated here, but I can tell that this one might need a bit more digging into it. So I'm going to do that after I go through all 9 principles and make sure that I understand the nitty-gritty or the tests of this principle. Number 3, educators understand and apply knowledge of student growth and development. I don't see any evidence here that they haven't understood that this could be good or could be bad for the students. They've talked about the idea that it might have gotten them out of the shell and so forth. That seems to be a pretty logical theory. And they haven't yet said that they somehow think that they would disregard what Carmen needs, so we're not at that point. Number 3 seems to have been okay to this point. Number 4, educators value the involvement and support of parents, guardians, families, and communities in schools. Well, up until this point, nobody has specified, the case has not indicated that anybody has specified a concern with this, and the school as a community is represented by that administrator, and so that administrator is given some oversight. So at this point, I would say this one hasn't been violated. However, I'd also like to look at it more deeply and understand how it guides us later on. So we'll look into this one more closely in a moment. Number 5, educators implement effective planning, instruction, assessment, and reporting practices to create respectful, inclusive environments for student learning and collaborative. Okay, well, maybe we need to have some idea of whether or not this is considered to be an effective planning process. Have they used tools that may or may not be in the ballpark? We better dive into this one in a minute. Number 6, they demonstrate a broad knowledge base and understanding of areas they teach. There's absolutely nothing in this case that suggests it's about what Mr. Pantages or Ms. Santucci or Ms. Ewan know. So there's really nothing here that questions their knowledge base, and so we simply would say there's no evidence to violate number 6. Number 7, similarly, there's nothing that says this has anything to do with the teacher doing or not doing some professional learning. There's just nothing that speaks to it, so it's not violated. No evidence. Number 8, there's no evidence in any way in this case that describes whether or not this educator is or is not contributing to the profession, for example, being a mentor or that sort of thing. So again, we would not see it as violated. Number 9 is all about introducing or being aware of the history of people with indigenous descents in our country. And while that's important, it doesn't seem to apply here, so there's no evidence it's been violated. So we have no evidence right now that anything's been violated, but there's 2 or 3 that we might want to dive into more deeply to make sure. And so let's do that. The first one we had to dive into is considered to be number 2. And I've highlighted in red the parts that might be particularly important as we look into the longer form. So it says that educators are held to a higher standard and are accountable for their conduct on duty. So let's check it. Has Mr. Pantages been open? Well, he has. He's gone and told his principal what's going on. And we can even tell that Ms. Ewan knows what has been agreed in the past. He's also agreed to change and not bring the dog to school if there's some issue. So up until this point, he's been accountable. We simply don't know whether or not Mrs. Santucci has told people, but there's no evidence that she's hidden it, and that's all we need. We'd have to have evidence that something was done wrong here in order to hold this person as contrary to this principle. And the other part in red, the educator's individual conduct contributes to the perception of the profession as a whole. This speaks to things like conflict of interest and being clearly motivated by what's good for our students. So initially, we might have had a concern about that. Mr. Pantages was going to save himself $125 a week by bringing his dog to school. That's a personal gain. But he also thought it might be good to bring the dog to school for the students. So he had two choices there. One was to simply not do it, and the other was to go to somebody at arm's length and ask for their approval, and he received it under certain conditions. He then complied with those conditions. In other words, the evidence suggests that he has done things in a way that would continue to have a healthy perception of teachers and educators as a whole. He's done something that was proactive and beneficial to his students, and he's done it in a way that's been open. So the evidence, after looking clear at this, suggests that not only has he not violated the principle, but he's done the specific things that would be required of him. What about the idea of educators valuing the involvement of families? It says educators, and again I've highlighted in red just so that you can see the parts that I think are more relevant. In real life, they're not highlighted. Educators understand, respect, and encourage the participation of families. Okay, so at this point, there's no evidence that any family has had any concern, and it doesn't specify that he will go and ask people a specific input, like, for example, getting them to give permission. If it said that, we might be concerned, but that's not here, and so there's no evidence he hasn't done that. What he does with with Carmen's family, well, that's going to determine if he remains in compliance here, but he hasn't done anything yet. And educators consider the perspectives of parents, guardians regarding their children, and they communicate effectively. Okay, so he hasn't failed to do that, but we can clearly see as we move into the second question what he'll have to make sure he does, what boxes he ticks. And number 5 was all about educators implementing effective practices. And I went through this and I could see nothing that said that they needed to do anything around animals particularly, but what it does say is that they value collaborative practice. So that tells me that they have to work with other people, including people on their own team and including people within the other parts of the stakeholder community, such as the student and family. At this point, Mr. Pantages has done that. He's collaborated with his supervisor. Whether he continues to do that is left up in the air. And so, now that we've looked closer at the 3 that needed a bit more exploration, we should be able to answer part 1. Has anybody violated any principles? And if so, can you name them and describe how they've been violated? And the answer is no. And we had to look first at the teacher. He was obligated to work collaboratively and to comply with the law. Up until this point, he has done that. The law allowed for the principal to give authority. He went to them before he took this choice, and he's complied with the agreement. They have done things that worked for the students, which was part of what we looked for, and they've been open to the idea that if the students weren't well served, he would change his practice. So there's simply no evidence of any violations by the teacher. I'd like you to take note of how I've explained this. I haven't just simply said something like, no, there's no evidence, because that is not a very careful way to communicate, and it's very likely you'll overlook things. So if you simply say that, you can expect that you will probably get a lower mark on your assignment. And we also had to consider the administrator, because remember, the administrator was a role player in the case, and they do have ethics. Administrators are educators, so they have the exact same ethics as the teacher. The administrator also had an ethical responsibility, and she has acted within them. Her actions were within her authority and compliant with all 9 standards. I went through them and no problem. The new administrator has had no reason at the beginning of her term to believe anything is different. So she knows what has been done, she knows there was an agreement, and she's allowed to say, that's evidence for me. That's good enough for now. So the answer to this question is, nobody has violated any principles. Now, because of space, I haven't indicated, and you could, that the parent and the daughter have not violated any ethics, but I could say that by simply adding, they don't have to comply with them. So question number 2 is, what's the best way to proceed? Explain fully, showing how your responses satisfy the acid test. Be comprehensive and detailed. In other words, what we're being asked here is to make sure that we choose an approach that is guided by the principals. And one of the things I like about the teachers is that they have standards. And remember, standards tell us what we should do. So that's really nice. Instead of making sure we don't do anything wrong, they kind of tell us how to behave. And so we need to make sure that we show that we've chosen a way of behaving that ticks all of the boxes. Now, I'm going to abbreviate here. I don't need to sort of show how bringing the dog connects to professional learning or to ancestry of people of indigenous descent, because I think those are fairly simple in this case. But I am going to deal with the ones that we looked more closely at. The standards indicate that we should communicate with the family and collaborate with our colleagues. As we do this, we need to make sure that we have the best interest of the students in mind and that we honor the public's expectations of educators. So those are the key ingredients of whatever I choose to do. And you'll notice I started by expressing those values before I started saying what I would do. As the educator, I can see that the dog being present is working well for the majority of students. I would like to see if there's a way to meet the needs of the larger student body without hurting Carmen. Can I make everybody happy? I would agree then to meet with Carmen and her mom to find out more specifically what her needs were. I would accept and respect that she had some particular needs in this area. In other words, I wouldn't be judgmental or indignified and try to tell them that we didn't accept their needs. I may ask the family if they would like us to consult with the school psychologist. Now I'm getting people with expertise beyond mine. I'm being more collaborative and I'm thinking about what might help that student in the bigger picture. This might help to look into methods for helping her overcome her fears. I may also inquire, sorry about the typo, to find out whether or not Cupcake, because she's a poodle and doesn't shed, might not cause this student allergies. That might be worthwhile. But it's a might. I would want to speak with Carmen and her family with the participation of the administrator in some way. For example, they might be present at the meetings or might simply get reports from me afterwards, or maybe there were two separate communications, myself with the family and the administrator. All of those would work. To see if we could come up with a plan, such as scheduling the dog to come at times when Carmen wasn't there, coming up with a gradual introduction plan, or finding ways to physically separate student and dog. For example, maybe the dog's at one end of the school while the student has all of their studies at the other end. That might work for that parent and child. I would also agree to review on a routine basis to see if the plan continued to serve Carmen and her family. Probably set out specific times for us to talk. And I would let that family know that they have the ability to say no to these ideas at any point, at the beginning, or if things seem to not be working. I would ensure that my supervisor, Mrs. Ewan, was comfortable with these provisions and would honor any direction she gave me. Okay? I would keep records of our plans and be prepared to answer questions by anybody further up the administration. Why did I choose these approaches? I'm wrapping up here, but I'm saying basically the things I said at the beginning of this section. I chose them because they tick all of the boxes. They approach all of the principles, including the idea of collaboration and family involvement, making sure that students are well served, and meeting all of the professional expectations around honoring the reputation of teachers, school district, and my school. So hopefully you've got something that is laid out similar, even if you don't have the exact same courses of action. You don't have the same courses of action, it doesn't mean you've done it wrong. If you can explain them from the principled perspective, then you're doing well. So that takes us to the last question. Can you think of other or alternative practices? And by this we mean practices that we would do instead of what we did before, not add to it, that could be used that would also be ethical. Describe them and explain why you didn't choose them. So I thought of two. Yes, I could simply agree to stop bringing Cupcake to school. That would guarantee that Carmen was comfortable, so that the student welfare needs were addressed for her, and that her family's needs were addressed, that we were being collaborative and that we were listening to families. Why didn't I choose that approach? Because I thought we might be able to provide for the larger student welfare, a way of making all the students happier. But that would have been an ethical alternative to simply say, the dog is optional and it's a big deal for Carmen, so I won't do it. Another option was that with the approval of my supervisor, I could offer to have Cupcake participate in class digitally, such as by video, when Carmen wasn't present. That way I wouldn't have to worry about allergies or triggering any fears from her. Why didn't I choose to do it? Well, I simply don't think, based on what I know about teaching, that it would be as effective as having the actual physical dog in the room. So that was part of my other standard around approaching practices that I knew would be effective, standard number 5. So they're all acceptable ideas, and they might end up being Plan B and Plan C. But for now, I'd like to start with option A. What we're simply pointing out is that there are multiple practices, multiple ways we could specifically reach these objectives of meeting the principles. But as long as we can see how all of the principles have been applied, we have done what the acid test calls for. We can't choose one over the others. We can simply try to get as many of them addressed as possible and see if we have an approach that does that as well as possible in each case. So how did you do? Did you consider the right code of ethics, or did you try to apply the one for CSWs? It wouldn't be terrible if you did, because they're very similar, but they're not identical. Did you think about who had ethical responsibility here and who did not? For example, did you recognize that the administrator had to file a code of ethics as well, and that there was a school psychologist or others in the school district who might be participants in collaboration? Did you think about the fact that the parent, the dog, and the child don't have ethical responsibilities? Did you explain in a clear and cohesive way why you chose the approaches that you did? So you might have had great answers, you might have known the right things, but you had to show your work, be able to explain it clearly. Did you follow the instructions, or did you actually get confused? And did you take your time and go through the whole process deliberately, comprehensively, and analytically? Because rushing will kind of get in the way of all this. We talked about this earlier. A lot of students assume that this means they have to do it from memory and that they have to do it quickly, but that simply isn't accurate. And I'll literally let you know that I had to go on the website for the BC Teacher Regulation Branch and actually get a real clear, precise understanding of each of the principles in order to give you this answer. So it's not something that even as an experienced educator is just simply memorized by me. That wouldn't be typical. All right, hopefully this has been a helpful video for you. And as always, if you have any questions, please don't hesitate to reach out to me and ask them. Have a great day.